April 15th, 1912. The North Atlantic. The sea is not dramatic up close. It is flat, cold, indifferent. A surface that looks workable until it isn't. In the dark, the horizon disappears, and everything that matters becomes inventory: wood, canvas, rope, the capacity of small boats measured in numbers that do not care who is standing beside them. On that night, a name that had been treated like an American institution is reduced to a line on a manifest. John Jacob Astor IV is not simply a wealthy man aboard a famous ship. He is a unit of social meaning, an heir to a fortune built to feel permanent, a surname that once functioned like a private credential in New York, a shorthand for a particular kind of control, property that collects rent in silence, networks that enforce status without needing laws. And then, in the early hours, the modern world does what it always does. It compresses a life into a headline. It turns an estate into an accounting problem. It tests whether influence can survive a crisis that offers no negotiation, no appeals, no second meeting. Astor's story is often told as a moral tableau: rich and poor, gallantry and panic, elegance and catastrophe. But the darker truth sits behind the symbols. The Titanic is not where his power begins. It is where the public finally sees how fragile that power always was, because the Astor fortune was never just money. It was systemized advantage, land, leases, social permissions, and the careful management of reputation across generations. When a man owns America's richest name, he does not own it the way he owns a hotel or a piece of real estate. He holds it temporarily, under rules written long before he is old enough to break them. And when he breaks them, when he collides with scandal, with modern media, with changing ideas of class and legitimacy, the name does not bend gently. It tightens. To understand why one heir could be treated as a national event, you have to begin where the Astor name was manufactured, in the geography, infrastructure, and legal machinery that turned Manhattan into a wealth engine. Background New York does not produce dynasties by accident. It produces them the way it produces bridges and banks, through design choices that look ordinary while they are being made. In the early 19th century, Manhattan is still small enough to understand from a height. A narrow island with a working shoreline. Piers, warehouses, streets that end at water. Money arrives not as finance yet, but as cargo: sugar, coffee, cotton, timber, manufactured goods. Everything that can be stacked, insured, and resold. Then the city decides to behave like a machine. In 1811, the Commissioner's Plan lays down the grid. It is not poetry. It is repeatable geometry. Long blocks, numbered streets, parcels that can be measured, sold, mortgaged, and subdivided. A grid does more than organize traffic. It standardizes land into units that lenders recognize. It creates predictable frontage. It turns geography into a ledger. By 1825, the Erie Canal links the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. Suddenly, the island is not simply a port. It becomes a hinge between continents and an interior that is opening fast. Grain moves, timber moves, people move. So does credit. New York's advantage is not only that it receives goods, it prices them, it insures them, it builds the paperwork that follows them. This is how the city makes certain kinds of wealth possible. Wealth that is patient, legalistic, and quiet. Real estate in Manhattan becomes a different category of power than trade. Trade is exposed to storms, wars, and price swings. Land is slower. Land collects. Land waits. Land turns other people's work into rent. The island's institutions mature around that fact. Banks learn to lend against property. Courts learn to defend contracts. Title systems become more disciplined. Leases become instruments of control. Mortgages spread risk and also spread dependency. A building can fail. The ground beneath it does not. The people who own ground are not required to be fashionable. They only need to be consistent. Over time, New York invents a class that lives inside paperwork. Deeds, trusts, options, ground rents. Long leases written to survive heirs, depressions, and scandal. It is a kind of power that does not need to speak loudly because it is already embedded into the city's daily motion. Every shop that opens, every tenant that signs, every business that depends on a location it will never truly own. This is the environment in which a richest name can be manufactured. The social world grows alongside the legal one. Wealth in Manhattan is not merely accumulated, it is certified. Private clubs, dinner lists, charity boards. A narrow set of families who function like a licensing authority for respectability. They do not pass laws, but they can decide who gets treated as permanent. By the late 19th century, that social machinery hardens. The city's money is no longer new enough to be excused for being crude. The richest families start to behave like custodians of an order. The point is not simply to spend. The point is to signal that spending is effortless, to make abundance look like tradition. The city's built environment becomes part of that performance. Central Park is planned in the 1850s and begins to reshape the geography of prestige. Fifth Avenue becomes a corridor where wealth is displayed as architecture. Stone, iron, and brick do what words cannot. They assert continuity. A house placed correctly is a kind of argument. It says the family intends to remain. At the same time, the city grows harsher beneath the surface. Immigration accelerates. Tenements densify. Labor becomes more visible and more organized. The gap between the front stage and the backstage widens. Drawing rooms above, service corridors behind, ballrooms lit for spectacle, basements built for heat and work. This tension matters because elite power in New York depends on a bargain that is rarely spoken aloud. The city will tolerate enormous private fortunes if those fortunes appear stabilizing. If they fund museums, hospitals, libraries, parks, if they sponsor order. If they do not embarrass the idea of hierarchy by making it look violent. But New York is also becoming modern, and modernity is not polite. The press expands. Photography becomes common. Sensational trials become public theatre. Scandal is no longer confined to whispers in a hallway. It becomes print. The city's ruling families have always managed reputation, but now reputation is exposed to a market. News sells, names sell. A famous surname becomes a kind of public property, argued over, resented, admired, and consumed. The economic cycles reinforce this reality. Panics hit, credit tightens, fortunes that rely on leverage get tested. People learn in public that some wealth is hollow and some is durable. Real estate. Dynasties often survive better than speculative ones, not because they are kinder, but because they are structured differently. Their wealth is anchored. Their income is divided into streams. Their assets are slow-moving and therefore harder to destroy quickly. By the time the Gilded Age reaches its fullest shine, Manhattan is a place where the richest families are not just rich. They are infrastructural. Their holdings shape neighborhoods. Their decisions affect streets, hotels, and entire blocks of commerce. Their names function like private currencies. A lender feels safer. A partner feels elevated. A door opens without explanation. And yet the same forces that built that supremacy are now capable of undermining it. Because a name that is valuable also becomes fragile. It must be protected. It must not be misused. It must withstand the city's new appetite for exposure. The more visible the elite become, the more they must act as if visibility does not matter. They must appear inevitable. This is the stage on which the Astor name becomes more than a family label. It becomes a form of urban property, an asset that draws value from the city's legal order, social order, and economic geography. A name that seems like inheritance, but behaves like an institution. And once a surname functions like an institution, the most important question is not how it was made, but how it is governed, who controls it, what rules keep it intact, and what happens when a later heir treats it like something personal. A dynasty only looks effortless from the outside. Inside, it is paperwork and restraint, rules designed to keep a fortune from becoming a series of personal impulses. The Astor fortune begins as a story Americans like to simplify: one man, one rise, one pile of money. But the more accurate version is colder. John Jacob Astor, born in 1763, dead in 1848, builds early wealth through trade and the fur business, then locks much of the family's long power into New York real estate. At his death, his estate is often estimated in the range of $20–30 million, a figure so large for the mid-19th century that it functions less like rich and more like a private financial system. From there, the dynasty behaves like an institution that has learned one lesson. The safest money is money that is hard to move quickly. Land, leases, buildings that sit where the city's future has no choice but to pass. That logic shapes the family's internal governance. The goal is not to produce genius heirs. The goal is to reduce the damage an heir can do. Old New York fortunes protect themselves through a combination of inheritance planning and social enforcement. Trusts and settlements are not just tools to save taxes or distribute assets. They are a way of telling the living what they are allowed to be. Money that arrives automatically can also be money that arrives with conditions. Income streams separated from principal, property held in structures meant to survive bad decisions, inheritance timed to age or milestones, family advisors positioned like guardrails. Even when specific documents stay private, the pattern is visible across elite New York. Wealth is treated as something to administer, not something to win. The Astors also developed something more unusual than money: name capital. Name capital is a resource that grows when it is used carefully and collapses when it is treated as personal property. It is the extra confidence a bank feels when the signature is familiar, the extra patience a creditor shows, the extra permission a city grants. In late 19th century Manhattan, the name itself can act like collateral because it implies networks, assets, and a long memory of debts paid. But it comes with a price. A famous surname is not private. It is a public symbol that other people use to talk about legitimacy. The family can own land, hotels, and art. It cannot fully own what the name means once newspapers and social commentary begin trading it like currency. This is where the Astors become more than a wealthy clan and start behaving like a branded system. By the end of the 19th century, different Astor branches are operating like separate managerial divisions of the same myth. Their holdings touch the city's status infrastructure: churches, museums, charities, and, most visibly, hotels. Hotels matter because they are public spaces built to feel private. They are architecture that sells hierarchy by the night. Who enters? Who is seen? Who is seated close to power? Who is serviced? Who is shut out? In 1893, the Waldorf Hotel opens at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street, tied to the Astor family's internal tensions and the use of prime land as a statement. In 1897, John Jacob Astor IV opens the neighboring Astoria Hotel, and the connected complex becomes what the public learns to call the Waldorf Astoria, a building that turns an elite surname into a physical address for modern New York. This is not merely glamour, it is strategy. A hotel at that scale is a machine for visibility. It makes the family unavoidable without requiring them to appear everywhere. It hosts other powerful people under Astor terms. It translates land into influence, and influence into more demand for the land beneath it. And this is the moment when John Jacob Astor IV can no longer be kept in the background. He is born in 1864, late enough that he does not build the original fortune, but early enough to inherit a world in which old families still believe they can govern the city's tone. He grows up inside systems built to keep the family permanent, social rules that feel like law, legal rules that feel like destiny. His role is not simply to spend, it is to embody continuity. But the era he lives in is changing the meaning of continuity itself. The late 19th and early 20th centuries are when elite privacy begins to fail as a defense. The press expands into mass circulation. Photography becomes common. Courts become public theatre. Divorce, once managed quietly, becomes story material. High society finds that it can no longer contain reputational damage through whispers because the modern city has invented a new kind of audience: strangers who feel entitled to judge. In that environment, an heir's personal life stops being personal. It becomes a referendum on the family's claim to legitimacy. John Jacob Astor IV's marriage and remarriage land directly in that new reality. He marries Ava Lowell Willing in 1891. They divorce in November 1909, and the divorce itself becomes a social event because the name involved is not an ordinary name. Then, in September 1911, he marries Madeline Force, who is 18 while he is 47, an age gap that turns private choice into public controversy in the very society that once specialized in discretion. This matters for the story not because scandal is interesting, but because it reveals the hidden mechanics of elite rule. Old New York can tolerate eccentricity when it stays behind curtains. What it struggles to tolerate is behavior that forces the system into daylight, because daylight requires explanation, and explanation is where hierarchy begins to look like mere preference rather than inevitability. When a leading name becomes a subject of open commentary, the family's control over meaning weakens. At the same time, the Astor fortune is not something an heir can simply pick up and carry. It is anchored to properties, contracts, long leases, and institutional relationships. That creates a quiet conflict. The individual can move quickly, but the fortune cannot. The city's modern tempo increases: news cycles, markets, social churn, while dynastic wealth remains slow and administrative. So John Jacob Astor IV sits at a crossroads that the earlier Astors never faced in the same way. He is wealthy in the old manner, but he is visible in the new one. He inherits a name designed to function like a private credential, and he lives in an age that treats famous names like public entertainment. That is the core pressure. Not whether he is rich, but what kind of power is actually being exercised. Through real estate, through architecture, through social enforcement, through political respectability, and through the economics of maintaining permanence in a city that no longer believes anything is permanent. Because once a surname becomes both an asset and a liability, the story stops being biography and becomes a set of angles, different faces of the same machine, each revealing what the Astor name could buy and what it could never fully control. In New York, the purest power is the kind that does not need to introduce itself. It sits in deeds and leases, in the slow geometry of the island, in the way certain families can decide what a block becomes simply by waiting longer than anyone else can afford to wait. The Astor name becomes powerful because it attaches itself to the city's underlying mechanics, not the fashionable layer, carriages, bulls, columnists, but the contractual layer. Manhattan is a place where ownership often means controlling the terms under which other people are allowed to operate. A lease can be softer than a law and more final. Rent arrives whether admiration does or not. That is why old fortunes prefer it. By the time John Jacob Astor IV is an adult, the Astor identity is already institutional. It is not just a man with assets. It is a family that the city has learned to treat as part of the city's operating system, present in real estate, present in the top strata of social infrastructure, and embedded in the idea of what counts as legitimate wealth. Encyclopedia Britannica summarizes him plainly as part of that machinery. An Astor by bloodline, an operator of large New York hotels, an inheritor of a family fortune built earlier in trade and then stabilized through property. But there is a hidden cost to this kind of power. It works best when it is impersonal. The more the public sees the person, the more the system is forced to explain itself. That explanation is dangerous because it invites judgment. Old New York depends on the assumption that its hierarchy is natural, quiet, inevitable, almost administrative. Once the hierarchy is described in public, it begins to look like a choice, and choices can be criticized. So the Astor power is built to avoid spectacle. It prefers the boardroom to the stage. Yet by the early 20th century, the stage is growing. Newspapers, photography, a mass public that consumes society as news. In that environment, the power that once lived safely inside paperwork becomes visible, and visibility becomes a form of vulnerability. Astor IV is the inheritor of a system that was designed for stability, not for modern attention. And that is why his power cannot be understood as mere wealth. It is the ability to keep a position in a city that is learning to challenge positions. A fortune like the Astors is often described as a mountain of money. In practice, it behaves more like an engineered landscape, assets structured to endure, income streams designed to be steady, and legal planning meant to survive the weakest link in any dynasty, the human being at the center of it. Astor IV is widely described as the wealthiest passenger aboard the Titanic, with an often cited estimate around $87 million at the time of his death. Richest in the room money, and also too large to be personal money. That estimate matters not because it is a trophy, but because it tells you what the public thought the Astor name represented, the ceiling of American private wealth. Yet the more important financial story is what happens when wealth becomes estate. When Astor dies in 1912, reporting and later summaries describe an estate in the mid-$80 million range, with the dominant share left to his son Vincent and structured provisions for his widow, money shaped by law, not by sentiment. In dynastic terms, this is the central act of self-preservation, keeping the principle aligned with the family line as it defines itself, while offering financial security that does not transfer the steering wheel. This is how old money survives scandal and reinvention. It compartmentalizes. It also reveals a darker truth about elite inheritance. The fortune does not simply enrich, it disciplines. It tells heirs what they can do without risking the architecture of the whole. It turns the family into a kind of corporation, with a surname where marriage, reputation, and succession are not private experiences but variables in a long equation. And because this wealth is attached to a famous name, the public participates in that equation. People argue about what the widow deserves, what the son inherits, what the family should do. The fortune becomes a public drama, even when its actual mechanisms are private. Trusts, bequests, and conditions that translate power into enforceable form. So when Astor is called a man who owned America's richest name, the unsettling part is that he may not have owned it at all. He managed it, briefly, within constraints that outlast him. If Astor wealth is the hidden skeleton, architecture is the skin, the visible proof that the system exists. In New York, the Grand Hotel is not merely a building. It is a control room for status. It organizes who is allowed to be seen, where they are seen, and under what terms. It converts land into a social instrument. The original Waldorf Hotel opens on March 13, 1893, at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street, built on land tied to the Astor family's internal geography and designed to be both modern and imposing. It is described as German Renaissance in style, designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg, and planned at a scale that signals ambition. Hundreds of guest rooms, large public rooms, and the invisible logistics that make luxury function: servant space, laundry, corridors that keep the labor of elegance out of sight. Then, in 1897, the Astoria Hotel opens next door, also by Hardenberg, creating the combined identity the city learns to call the Waldorf Astoria, an address that becomes shorthand for the top layer of New York life. This matters because it shows how the Astors convert property into cultural authority. A private mansion is a statement for a few. A grand hotel is a statement for a city. It allows the family to host power without appearing to chase it. It makes their land productive not just financially, but reputationally. The building becomes a factory that manufactures prestige. But hotels also reveal the built-in contradiction of old money in a modern city. The hotel depends on novelty, new services, new standards, new expectations of luxury. The dynasty depends on permanence. The architecture sits between those needs, trying to look timeless while running on constant reinvention. And that is why the Waldorf Astoria is more than a backdrop. It is the Astor system made visible. Land turned into a public stage where hierarchy is sold as comfort, and where a surname becomes something you can enter through revolving doors. By the time the story turns towards scandal, remarriage, and finally the sea, the essential tension is already built into stone. A dynasty designed for control, living inside a century that has started to demand spectacle. Old New York never relied on police power to defend itself. It relied on selection. A city can have enormous wealth and still feel socially small if the gatekeeping is disciplined enough. In late 19th century Manhattan, that discipline is not written into law. It is written into lists, invitations, and the quiet authority of people who decide what counts. Ward McAllister, one of the era's best-known social arbiters, helped popularize the phrase, the 400, a way of implying that New York society could be reduced to a fixed capacity, with everyone else standing outside the ballroom. In 1892, that idea becomes openly public when a version of the list is published in the press, turning private admission rules into something the broader city can see, measure, and resent. The important fact is not the number, it is the method. Society behaves like a credentialing body, and it treats families like brands whose value rises or falls with adherence to expectation. The Astor name sits at the center of that system, which means an Astor heir is not free in the way a merely wealthy man might be free. A private failure does not stay private when the surname itself functions as a public standard. The hierarchy is designed to look effortless, but it is maintained through continuous enforcement. Who is greeted, who is seated, who is visited, who is ignored. That is why divorce and remarriage land so heavily. They are not just personal events. They are disruptions to the social logic that old New York uses to justify itself. If the leading names can break the rules openly, then the rules begin to look like preference instead of permanence. And once they look like preference, they become debatable. By the time John Jacob Astor IV is in the full light of adulthood, New York is already shifting from whispered governance to printed governance. The same city that once protected elite discretion is now selling it. The social system can still punish, but it cannot fully contain. It can close doors. It cannot stop the public from watching the doors close. So the heir lives under a double pressure: to behave as a custodian of a name, and to survive in a modern world that increasingly treats names as entertainment. That tension does not announce itself as tragedy at first. It appears as irritation, then as distance, then as scandal that refuses to stay behind curtains. For families like the Astors, patriotism is not only belief, it is insurance. American elite legitimacy in this era depends on proving usefulness. Philanthropy helps. Institutions help. But nothing stabilizes a fortune's public position like service during national crisis, especially service that can be described in official terms. John Jacob Astor IV cultivates that kind of legitimacy. During the Spanish-American War period, he is commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in U.S. volunteers, and he supports the war effort with money and logistics, placing his yacht at the government's disposal and equipping an artillery unit for use in the conflict. This is influence in its most recognizable form, turning private resources into public capacity and ensuring that the family name can be spoken in the language of national duty rather than only in the language of privilege. But influence is also built through the quieter systems that sit beside government: boards, projects, land use, the built environment. Astor's hotel development is not separate from influence. It is one of its most practical expressions. The St. Regis, New York, developed by Astor and completed in 1904, treats luxury as a technical problem to solve, a way of shaping what modern elite life should feel like in a city that is racing upward. In other words, his public role has two faces. One is visible in uniform, attached to official vocabulary. The other is embedded in architecture and service standards that train the upper class to regard certain addresses as natural centers of gravity. This is why his later controversy matters more than gossip. When a man like Astor is celebrated, the celebration is not personal. It is institutional, a signal that the system is coherent, that old money is still responsible, that the city's hierarchy can claim a public purpose. When the same man becomes a scandal, the damage is also institutional. It suggests that the hierarchy cannot govern its own heirs. And once a dynasty is forced to defend itself in public, once it must argue that it is still legitimate, the argument itself becomes a form of loss. The public thinks of the Astors as owners of luxury. The private reality is that luxury is one of the most demanding categories of business on earth. A grand hotel is not like a townhouse. It is a continuous operation. Heat, light, linen, food, staff, repairs, and 1,000 invisible routines required to make the visible experience look effortless. The original Waldorf Hotel, opened March 13, 1893, is designed at a scale that makes prestige measurable. Hundreds of guest rooms, public rooms meant for display, and extensive servant facilities that keep the labor of luxury out of sight. When the neighboring Astoria opens in 1897, it expands that operational burden again. More rooms, more public space, more expectation. This is where old money's darker arithmetic appears. To look permanent, you must pay permanently. Maintenance is not romantic, it is cash flow. It is the ability to absorb shocks, recessions, changing tastes, labor costs, and the simple fact that a building starts decaying the moment it opens. The larger the stage, the more expensive it is to keep the illusion intact. And because hotels sit in the public eye, they cannot merely function. They must keep up with the city's idea of what modern looks like. That creates a structural problem for dynasties. Old wealth is slow and often designed to preserve principle. Modern luxury is fast and requires continuous reinvestment. A family can be extremely rich and still feel pressure if its wealth is tied up in land and long-term structures, while the market demands upgrades now. The sustainability question is not whether the Astors can afford grandeur once. It is whether the system that produced grandeur can survive a century of upgrades, taxes, competition, and public scrutiny, especially when the personal life of an heir begins to pull attention away from the machinery that actually keeps the fortune alive. And that is where the angles converge into the turning point. A name built to operate like an institution is about to be tested as if it were a person, through divorce, remarriage, and the legal engineering that follows when private choices threaten the dynasty's design. Climax. In dynastic families, the first real crisis rarely looks like a crisis. It arrives as a personal decision that forces the institution to expose its operating rules. By 1909, John Jacob Astor IV is not just wealthy and prominent. He is structurally important to the mythology of old New York, an era that claims its authority through restraint, through continuity, through the idea that the richest families can govern themselves. That claim depends on a simple condition: the private lives of the elite must remain private enough to be managed. Divorce breaks that condition. In late 1909, Ava Lowell Willing Astor files for divorce, and the case moves through the state's machinery with the kind of attention usually reserved for political events. The details matter less than the fact of exposure. The moment the marriage becomes public procedure, documents filed, dates recorded, a judgment rendered, the Astor name stops being a private credential and becomes public material again. For old New York, this is not merely embarrassment, it is a systems problem. A dynasty is designed to feel permanent. Divorce is the opposite, a legal statement that permanence failed. It forces the family's internal discipline into the open. It invites scrutiny of money flows, living arrangements, custody, settlements, subjects that elite life is built to keep off stage. Even when exact figures vary by account, what the public sees is the same: a private household converted into enforceable terms. The scandal intensifies because the timing is wrong for the culture that raised him. The older social order expects a long pause after a rupture, time for discretion to rebuild itself, time for the machinery of reputation to soften the edges. Astor does not give it that pause. In August 1911, his engagement becomes known. In September, he remarries. On September 9th, 1911, John Jacob Astor IV marries Madeline Force at Beechwood, the family's Newport property, as he is 47, she is 18. The numbers become part of the story because modern media turns numbers into verdicts. And the wedding becomes more than a ceremony. It becomes a test of whether the Astor name can still command acceptance simply by existing. Here is where the turning point becomes unavoidable. The dynasty discovers the limits of its own insulation. Old New York could punish outsiders by denying access. It could apply silence as a weapon. But it struggles when the controversy is generated from inside the house, when the heir himself forces the system to choose between protecting a person and protecting a standard. Even the logistical details of the marriage start to read as evidence of strain: clergy who refuse, the search for someone who will officiate, the sense that the usual rituals of society are not operating smoothly. Astor's position makes this sharper. He is not only a beneficiary of tradition, he is also an architect of modern luxury, a man associated with large-scale hotels and the public face of elite comfort. That combination, old blood, modern enterprise, means he cannot be dismissed as merely reckless or merely conventional. He is a bridge between eras, and bridges get stressed when the landscape shifts on both sides. The social backlash, in practical terms, has a shape. It changes who appears at dinners. It changes what doors open automatically. It changes the tone of newspaper coverage and the ease with which strangers speak about the family as if the family were a public institution. The more the story is discussed, the more the old order is forced to reveal that it has always depended on being discussed less. This is where the darker mechanics of elite life come into focus. Reputation is not decoration. It is infrastructure. In a dynastic system, marriage is not simply romance or companionship. It is governance. It determines heirs, alliances, social positioning, and the future control of property. When Astor remarries so soon, and in a way that invites commentary, he is not just changing his private life. He is altering how the fortune can be narrated and who has standing inside the family structure that will outlive him. And that is why the family response is never only emotional, it is administrative. A dynasty adapts by compartmentalizing. It separates public posture from private control. It keeps the long-term mechanisms intact, even if the surface becomes turbulent. This is the method New York's oldest fortunes rely on. They cannot stop scandal from existing, but they can prevent scandal from rewriting the underlying asset map. So, Astor and Madeline leave. They travel for months, Europe, then Egypt, an extended distance meant to let the city's attention burn through its fuel. In old New York logic, time is always a solvent. Wait long enough, and the machinery of society will resume its normal pattern. But modernity has changed the chemistry. Newspapers do not forget. They simply rotate subjects. Public curiosity does not disappear. It is redirected. The scandal does not die. It becomes part of the name. By early 1912, the couple begins moving back toward New York. Madeline is pregnant. The practical problem is straightforward. Return home, re-enter society, reassert order. But the symbolic problem is larger. The Astor name must prove that it can absorb disruption without losing its claim to inevitability. It must return from the world and take its place again in Manhattan, as if nothing essential has changed. That return requires a crossing. Ocean, schedule, tickets. A ship chosen not only for transport, but for what it represents in the modern age. And in April 1912, the couple books passage on the most famous new vessel on the Atlantic route, a floating demonstration of engineering, class division, and confidence. Precisely the kind of modern machine the Astor system has always relied on, until the night that machine fails. April 10th, 1912 begins like a schedule. Southampton, a timetable, gangways and trunks, white paint still clean enough to look permanent. The ship is sold as an answer to a modern fear, that the world has grown too large and too fast to be trusted. Steel, watertight compartments, electric light, wireless messages, systems meant to make distance feel manageable. For first-class passengers, the ship is not only transport, it is a moving extension of New York's hierarchy. The same logic that governs Fifth Avenue governs the decks. Separation by price, by access, by the kind of privacy money can purchase even in a crowd. John Jacob Astor IV boards, with Madeline after months away from Manhattan's gaze. He is returning with a new marriage already judged, and with a future heir on the way. That matters, because dynastic power is always future tense. The institution can survive scandal if succession remains legible, if the line continues, if the machinery of inheritance stays intact. The ship carries that assumption too, an assumption of continuity. You sail, you arrive, you step back into your place. For days, nothing challenges it. The Atlantic in April is cold but orderly, a surface that encourages confidence because it does not advertise what it can do. Meals arrive on time. Conversations repeat themselves. The world's richest people do what they always do in controlled environments. They convert uncertainty into routine. Then, on the night of April 14th, the routine meets a limit. A collision at sea does not feel like the movies. It is not an explosion. It is interruption. A soft, wrong vibration. A shiver through structure. A pause in music. The kind of small anomaly that people initially deny because denial is part of comfort. But the ship's design, its compartments, its supposedly modern logic, now becomes a set of constraints. Water moves where it should not. Doors close. The physics of the ocean begins its slow, irreversible work. Inside the ship, the crisis does what crises do. It turns status into procedure. First, the officers need order. Then they need time. Then they discover they do not have enough of it. The lifeboats reveal the real anatomy of class, not because anyone announces it, but because the ship is built around it. Routes to the boat deck are clearer for some passengers than others. Information flows differently. The staff assigned to assist first class are trained, numerous, and present. In lower decks, the same ship becomes harder to navigate, both physically and administratively. Even in first class, safety becomes a rationed commodity. A lifeboat is a simple object, with a hard limit. Its capacity is not influenced by wealth. It does not expand to accommodate reputations. Astor's role in the final hours is described in ways that became part of the ship's legend. He ensures Madeline is placed into a lifeboat. He asks questions. He tries to negotiate rules that are not negotiable. The most striking thing is not any single act, but the reversal of his normal world. In New York, the Astor name can shape circumstances. On the open sea, circumstances shape the name. Madeline leaves the ship. This is where the personal story and the institutional story lock together. The dynasty does not only need the man to survive, it needs the pregnancy to survive. It needs the future to remain viable. A fortune that lasts generations is always choosing between protecting present power and preserving future control. The lifeboats pull away. The ship's lights remain on for a time, and that detail becomes its own kind of cruelty. Modernity continuing to perform even as it fails. When the Titanic goes down in the early hours of April 15th, 1912, the ocean imposes a final accounting. It is not moral. It is arithmetic, exposure, temperature, minutes. A famous man can die in the same way as an unknown one, and the water does not care what the newspapers will print later. The aftermath begins immediately, but not as grief, as logistics. Survivors arrive with fragments of information that do not agree. Names are missing. Lists are revised. Telegrams are sent. Newspapers fill columns with uncertainty, then fill them again with certainty, because modern audiences demand closure whether or not closure is available. In New York, the Astor name shifts categories overnight. It is no longer simply a living asset. It becomes a problem to administer. The moment an heir dies, the dynasty moves from social management to legal management. Lawyers do not need emotion. They need documents. Marriage certificates, divorce decrees. Astor's second marriage makes this sharper. Not because it is romantic or scandalous, but because it complicates the institutional map. A first marriage produces established expectations. A divorce disrupts them. A remarriage, especially to a young bride, pregnant at the time of the disaster, creates competing claims that must be resolved through structures built to prevent public chaos. probate proceedings, executors, trustees, and settlements that translate private relationships into enforceable outcomes. The body recovery operations in the days after the sinking add another layer of modern procedure. Ships are sent to search. The dead are identified by clothing, papers, and personal items. Even here, class leaves a signature. Some bodies are identified faster because they carry better documentation, better made clothes, clearer markers of identity. The ocean refuses hierarchy, but the recovery effort reintroduces it through the mechanisms of identification. When Astor is confirmed dead, the meaning of his life is rewritten almost instantly into two narratives that will never fully reconcile. One narrative is public and symbolic: the richest passenger, the famous heir, the great name lost in a modern catastrophe. The story becomes an emblem of an era: wealth confronted by nature, the limits of engineering, the spectacle of class tested in a crisis. The other narrative is private and technical: estate administration, asset control, the placement of money into structures that can survive scandal and survive sympathy. A fortune designed to last cannot be distributed according to emotion alone. It must be distributed according to the dynasty's design. And this is the decisive turn. The Astor name survives, but the Astor man does not. The institution remains standing, but it has to rebalance itself around a vacancy at the top. It has to decide how to protect the main line, how to provide for the widow, how to prevent public fascination from becoming legal vulnerability, and how to restore the impression that the dynasty is still intact, even after the most visible kind of rupture. The shipwreck does not end the story. It forces it into its truest form. Because from this point onward, the Astor fortune is no longer about what an heir chooses to do. It is about what the system does when the heir is gone, who gains control, who loses leverage, and how a richest name continues operating when it becomes history instead of a living presence. Aftermath. In New York, disasters are processed in two parallel languages. One is emotional, spoken in crowds and headlines, in memorial services and private telegrams. The other is administrative, spoken in court filings, estate inventories, and the quiet movement of control from a living person to a set of documents that must now function in his place. For the Astor name, the second language begins almost immediately. In the days after April 15, 1912, confirmation turns into procedure. A death at sea becomes a legal fact only when it can be recorded, certified, and attached to an identity that the courts will recognize. Once that happens, John Jacob Astor IV stops being an individual actor and becomes an estate, an entity that can be valued, divided, defended, and taxed. The public sees the symbol first. Newspapers repeat the same few phrases because they are easy for an audience to hold: richest passenger, famous heir, old New York. The story becomes a civic parable about wealth meeting its limits. But inside the dynasty, the urgent question is not symbolism. It is continuity. An old fortune survives by making succession boring. The Astor system is built to keep the center of gravity inside the main line, assets placed where they are hardest to splinter, the bulk of control directed toward the heir who best preserves the family's long-term architecture. And in 1912, the socially legible heir is not Madeline Force Astor, newly married and suddenly widowed. It is Vincent Astor, the adult son from Astor's first marriage, positioned to inherit not just money, but the role of custodian. That does not mean the widow is ignored. It means she is handled through structure. In dynastic terms, a widow is both an obligation and a vulnerability. An obligation because abandoning her damages legitimacy, and a vulnerability because her legal standing can produce uncertainty at exactly the moment the family must project stability. So the solution tends to be financial security without transfer of steering power, income, trusts, property use rights, protections that satisfy duty while keeping strategic control aligned with the primary heir. Madeline's pregnancy makes the situation more delicate, because dynasties do not only manage present relationships, they manage future claims. A posthumous child is not an abstract possibility, it is a looming legal reality. If the child is born, the estate must account for another heir with a legitimate stake. And legitimacy is not sentimental in this world, it is a legal category with consequences. That birth arrives in August 1912, when Madeline gives birth to a son. The child becomes living proof that the story is not finished, and also a reminder that every clause written before the ship sailed now has to function under public attention. The family has to ensure the child is provided for without destabilizing the inheritance structure that keeps the larger fortune coherent. So the estate moves through New York's legal machinery with the same controlled pace that made the Astors powerful in the first place. Probate steps, executors, valuations, distributions, shaped to minimize disruption. It is not only about money, it is about preventing the fortune from becoming a public brawl. At the same time, reputational management runs quietly alongside the legal process. Old New York understands that a name can be damaged by appearing either too cold or too chaotic. If the family looks ruthless, it invites resentment. If it looks disorganized, it invites predators, lawsuits, opportunists, rivals who want to exploit uncertainty. So the posture must be balanced. Solemnity in public, firmness in private, generosity displayed in forms that do not shift control. And then there is the physical side of aftermath, the built empire that cannot mourn. Hotels do not close because a founder dies. Staff still show up. Guests still demand service. Bills still arrive. The machinery of luxury continues to run, and that continuity becomes part of the brand's survival strategy. If the public sees the Astor world still functioning, addresses still prestigious, operations still smooth, it reinforces the idea that the dynasty is bigger than any one man. But beneath that smoothness is a permanent alteration. Astor IV's death freezes his story at a moment when his personal life had already become a public referendum. The remarriage that unsettled society now becomes inseparable from the tragedy that ends the marriage. The widow becomes an object of scrutiny as much as sympathy, and the heir from the first marriage becomes not only a beneficiary, but a symbol of order restored. This is the paradox of elite survival. The family must appear above drama while performing constant calculation. By the end of 1912, the broad shape is clear, even if the details remain private. The main line is secured. The widow is provided for. The new child is accounted for. The estate continues to operate. The city is given a narrative of dignity rather than conflict. But the deeper consequences haven't arrived yet, because those take time. The real test of a dynasty is not how it behaves in the week after a disaster. It is what happens years later, when the public attention fades, when taxes and maintenance keep grinding, when buildings age, when new money builds taller, and when the old name must either adapt or slowly surrender ground. In the short term, a famous name can survive almost anything. Grief creates a temporary shield. Sympathy discourages open attacks. Even scandal can be softened when it is attached to tragedy. But dynasties don't collapse in the short term. They erode. They erode when the environment that once rewarded their habits stops rewarding them, and when the costs of appearing permanent begin to rise faster than the returns of actually being permanent. For the Astors, That environment is Manhattan itself. The city that produced their power keeps changing its rules without asking permission. Land values rise, but so do taxes, labor costs, and the sheer expense of maintaining properties to the standards expected by a modern elite. The old model, hold land, collect rent, let time do the work, still functions, but it no longer produces dominance automatically. New wealth arrives through industry, then finance, then corporate structures that move faster than hereditary governance. Old New York's social monopoly weakens as well. The right people still matter, but the definition of right expands and becomes more negotiable. Institutions that once acted like social licensing boards begin to admit new patrons because they need money at modern scale. Newspapers continue to feed public curiosity, and the old families discover that privacy is no longer a wall. It is a thin curtain. This is where a dynasty faces its hardest truth. Reputation cannot substitute for competitiveness forever. The great Astor hotels illustrate that truth in stone and in arithmetic. A grand hotel is a prestige machine, but it is also a maintenance trap. It must renovate to stay relevant. It must compete with newer buildings, newer standards, newer tastes. And eventually, even a legendary address can become less valuable than the land beneath it if the city's center of gravity shifts. That shift is not a sudden betrayal. It is an urban habit. Neighborhoods change. Transit reshapes foot traffic. Fashionable districts migrate north, then east, then into entirely new centers. A property that once sat at the heart of prestige can find itself surrounded by commerce that no longer flatters it. And when that happens, the dynasty faces a choice it hates: sell or spend. Selling is psychologically difficult for old money because selling feels like admitting the future does not belong to you. Spending is financially difficult because spending at modern scale never ends. Either choice reduces control. As the decades pass, the Astor name remains famous, but the nature of its fame subtly changes. It becomes less like a governing credential and more like cultural memory, a word that signifies an older New York, even for people who never met an Astor and never stepped into an Astor building. That transformation accelerates in the 20th century for reasons that have nothing to do with any single heir. Inheritance taxes and changing tax regimes reshape what staying rich requires. Corporate ownership models become more efficient than family stewardship. Philanthropy becomes more institutional and less personal, meaning families can no longer rely on symbolic donations to purchase unquestioned legitimacy. And the city's skyline becomes a competition of capital intensity. Steel and glass towers that demand financing structures larger than the old dynastic methods were designed to handle. Even when an old family remains wealthy, it can lose dominance simply by becoming one wealthy group among many. What makes this aftermath darker is that it doesn't announce itself. There is no single day when the Astors stop mattering. There is only a sequence of practical decisions, each one defensible, each one slightly narrowing the dynasty's range. A building is sold because it is logical. A property is redeveloped because the market is asking for it. A hotel is renamed or rebuilt because the brand must evolve. A family branch disperses because modern life makes centralized governance harder. None of these moments look like collapse. Together, they form one. And by the time the century reaches its midpoint, Manhattan itself has begun to treat its old elite landmarks differently. The city is no longer a museum of dynastic permanence. It is a machine for renewal. It tears down what it no longer needs, then names the replacement something that sounds timeless. This is why the Astor story cannot be reduced to a shipwreck. The Titanic is the symbolic turning point, an event that fixes an heir in public memory. But the true aftermath is the slow proof that a name can outlive a fortune's dominance, and that dominance can disappear without the family ever becoming poor. The Astors remain part of American cultural language. Waldorf Astoria remains an iconic phrase. Astor remains a familiar signifier of old wealth. But a signifier is not the same thing as power. Power is the ability to shape outcomes quietly. By the end of the long arc, the dynasty's relationship to Manhattan is more historical than commanding. The city still carries Astor fingerprints in property history, in hotels, in the mythology of old New York. But the city no longer needs the Astors to function. That is the ultimate change. The machine that once rewarded their strategy has grown beyond any one family's ability to govern it. And once the environment changes, the story's final movement becomes unavoidable. Not a dramatic collapse, but a calm recognition that the most durable wealth in America is not the wealth that seems the largest, but the wealth that adapts fastest, often at the cost of the very permanence it once claimed. That realization is where the narrative closes. Not in scandal, not even in tragedy, but in a quieter question about what a richest name really means when history keeps moving. Closure. A dynasty wants to be mistaken for nature. It wants its position to feel like geography, fixed, dependable, beyond argument. That is the real ambition behind the Astor name. Not simply to be rich, but to be treated as a permanent feature of New York's landscape, like the island itself. For a time, the city cooperated. Manhattan rewarded the people who understood that land could outlast commerce, that contracts could outlast personalities, that a fortune could be built like a structure, slow, reinforced, designed to carry weight across generations. In that environment, Astor became more than a family name. It became a form of confidence that other people borrowed. Banks, institutions, society, even the city's idea of itself. John Jacob Astor IV inherits that confidence already manufactured. He does not create the machine. He is placed inside it, expected to operate it without leaving fingerprints. But the modern age makes fingerprints unavoidable. His divorce and remarriage are not merely personal events in a gilded biography. They are signals that the old system is losing one of its key protections: privacy. A surname that once functioned as a private credential begins to behave like public property, argued over in print, measured in gossip, judged by people who never needed an invitation to do the judging. Then the ocean removes the last illusion that elite power can always negotiate its way out. The Titanic is remembered as a catastrophe of modern confidence, but it is also a clean lesson in limits. It shows that the world's most carefully engineered environments still contain hard boundaries: capacity, temperature, time. A famous name can buy comfort, access, and priority, but it cannot buy a different physics. After his death, the story becomes what dynastic stories always become in the end: administration. Not because the family is heartless, but because power that lasts must be converted into procedure. Estates become documents, relationships become clauses, continuity becomes a legal plan. The institution survives by being less emotional than the people inside it, and in that survival sits the darker truth. When a man owns America's richest name, he is never fully its owner. He is its temporary steward, constrained by expectations he did not invent and judged by an audience he cannot control. The name survives him, but it also controls him, shaping what he is allowed to do, and determining what the world will remember even when the details are gone. In the long arc, the Astor legacy becomes a kind of American mirror. It reflects how power is built quietly through systems rather than drama, through property law, infrastructure, social licensing, and the patient accumulation of advantage. It also reflects how that power decays, not in flames, but in slow adaptation, sale by sale, renovation by renovation, as the city changes its terms and old permanence becomes an expensive illusion. A richest name can last for centuries, but history does not guarantee dominance to anyone, not even to the families who once seemed designed to be permanent. In the end, the most revealing part of the Astor story is not that a great heir died in a famous disaster. It is that the name lived on, still recognizable, still heavy, still useful, while the world that once made it untouchable kept moving, indifferent, like the sea.